Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be editing this photo in Lightroom. This photo already looks pretty good, and what we're going to be doing is adding a little bit more dimension. We're going to be making it look a little bit more 3D. A lot of the times the drone photos look kind of 2D, they look kind of flat because of the perspective, and I think I'm going to be adding a little bit more color to this as well. The rocks in this photo look kind of lifeless, and I want to increase the saturation of those as well. So let's go ahead and get started. For my exposure and my contrast, I'm going to raise my contrast a little bit. Alright, so around 10 is good. And for the highlights, I want to decrease this because I think the waves are a little bit overexposed, so I'm going to decrease this by a little bit. You can see that the waves become less pronounced as I decrease that. I'm going to decrease this around 11, and I'm going to move on to the whites, and I'm going to decrease this by around 20. So we changed it a little bit, made it a little bit more balanced, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the blacks. If we decrease the blacks, it gives our photo a little bit more dimension. You can see when I decrease the blacks even more, it makes these areas pop out, right? That's a little bit too much, so we're going to raise it back to around 14, and that looks good. For the shadows, I think I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit. There are parts of this area that I want to raise. So these are like the more black areas, these are the more shadow areas, so I'm going to raise it a little bit, maybe around 11, and that looks good. Alright, for these sliders, the presence, this is where I'm going to be emphasizing on more of the rocks, and I'm going to increase the texture. Texture around 20 look good. Alright, and you can see if I keep cranking that, it looks very artificial. So around just 20 looks very good for this photo. We're also going to increase the clarity. You see all these small white streaks in the ocean? I can increase that by increasing the clarity. And there we go. So 39 looks a little bit too much for me, so I'm going to do around 26. For the vibrance, I'm actually going to increase this. I'm going to increase this by a good amount. I say 30 is a good amount. And the saturation, we're going to increase this as well. We're going to increase this by 10. So look at how much color is brought back to this photo right here. Alright, so now I actually think the rocks are a little bit too blue. I did take this during sunset, so the rock should be lit up by the sun because I took this during sunset. So I'm just going to increase the slider by a little bit, not too much, not to a point where the water becomes like this greenish blue color. Okay, I still want to keep this aqua color, so I'm going to increase my temperature just by a little bit. We're going to move on to the tone curve. I'm going to hit point curve. I want to decrease the shadows a little bit, add a little bit more contrast, and I can do that by adding an S curve. I'm going to move back up here because I think the whites are still a little bit too pronounced. So I'm going to decrease this by a little bit. I'm going to make it around -33, and that looks a lot more balanced. Let's go ahead and move on to color. So I do like the hues of the blue a lot, and I don't want to change any of that. But I do want to change the colors of the rocks, such as these patches of small grass and whatever is growing on the rock basically. So these rocks look kind of yellowish, so I'm going to shift them more towards the orange side. So I'm going to just move these two sliders. So you can see that we have yellow, orange, and some reds now. Alright, so that adds a lot of dimension to the photo, I believe. We're going to move on to saturation. I want to increase the aqua color by a little bit, around 20, 22 is good. Watch what happens when I increase blue. If I increase blue, the shadows get more saturated, like these areas on the rocks, and I definitely don't want that. So I'm actually going to decrease the saturation of blues by -5, and that does very well for the photo. For luminance, I'm actually going to increase the luminance of the aquas, and I'm going to increase the luminance of the blues by a little bit. I don't think I'm going to do any color grading here. I think it looks fine like this already. If I do any color grading, it's going to give it a very unnatural look, so I'm going to skip that. Moving on to detail. So I definitely want to increase the detail. If I zoom in, it doesn't look too sharp, as you can see. I shot this at f2.2, 1/15 of a second, and ISO 100. I needed to make sure that the shutter speed was fast enough. I definitely want to sharpen this image. For masking, I also hit Alt, and then I drag the slider so I can see the lines that I'm sharpening. And it looks like 100 in this case is good. So by default, it adds 40 sharpening, and that's a good amount, I think. For noise reduction, there's not too much noise in this photo, so we're going to skip over that. Lens correction, make sure to check both of these. So for calibration, you do want to take this into account. Some drones do not have accurate color. So for my drone, I think adding some saturation in the blue primary makes it look more natural for my drone. Also, increasing this by 5 here looks pretty natural as well. That's good enough for the calibration. So like I said earlier, I want to dodge and burn some parts of the ocean, like this nice aqua color in the middle. So we're going to be using range mask to do that. Alright, so I'm going to drag a huge radial filter over this area right here. Make sure that you have feather on 100 and you invert it. Okay. And now we're going to add a range mask and we're going to add color. So what we're basically doing is selecting parts that we want, like the colors that we want, and we can increase the exposure or clarity based on what we selected. Alright, so all you have to hit is color range selector right here. Make sure you press shift and you can click multiple points. So right here, these are all colors that I want. I think you can click 5 and there you go. So as you can see, if we increase the exposure, it doesn't affect the rocks at all, right? So we're just affecting these colors right here. So that looks pretty good. That looks good. I'm going to probably decrease it by a little bit. I'm also going to increase the clarity because I want these colors to pop. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to hit this button so we get rid of that tool. I'm going to duplicate it so we have it over this area right here. Okay. Alright, so take a look at the before and after. We added so much dimension to these waves over here. Okay, so on the contrary, you see these areas that are darker. I want to burn these areas. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a big radial filter and I'm going to select colors that I want to burn. I'm going to go to range mask, color, and then I'm going to use the eyedropper tool and I'm going to select these darker areas. Alright, so those are the colors that I want. And I'm just going to decrease the exposure. Ooh, look at that. Before and after. And we can also increase clarity by a little bit. Alright, so we're going to be doing more of that to over here. So we're going to do the same thing. Go to range mask, color, and then use the eyedropper tool. We're going to select this color, this color, this color, this color, and this color. We want to increase the exposure a little bit. We don't want to do it too much. I want to increase the contrast too. Alright, I think that looks good. And then now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to make another one. And then go to range masks, color, eyedropper tool, you know the deal. Alright, so we're going to be precise here. We got to select the colors that we want. Here, 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 here. Alright. You can see that it affected this area as well, so I'm going to take my brush and I'm just going to erase this area. Alright. You can see that the red areas, the areas being affected. Got to erase them here and here. Alright, I'm going to hit done. I think that looks a lot better. You can see before and after. Look at how much contrast that we added into the water. Alright, so I think this area and this area need to be closed off a little bit. It's kind of distracting. It's not really part of the image. I really want to focus on the water, right? So what I'm going to do is create these graduated filters and I'm going to decrease exposure over here, okay? And I'm going to do a range mask and make it luminance this time. And luminance is a little bit different from color and it's based on luminance values. So if I move my slider to this side, you can see that the brighter parts are not being affected, only the darker parts are becoming darker, right? Whereas if I move it to this side, the darker sides are also being affected. Alright, so I'm going to just do a little bit luminance. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to put one on the other side as well, just to close it off. Alright, that looks good. Now I'm going to add one more mask over this entire thing. I'm gonna select the brightest of the brights. So you see this huge radial filter. And I'm gonna make one more color range masks, and I'm gonna zoom in here. All right. So I'm gonna only pick the brightest blue. So right here, and right here. All right, I'm gonna zoom back out. And we're gonna increase the exposure by a tad bit. I want to increase that by a little bit to give it another layer of dimension. I think it's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to go back here. And I'm going to decrease the exposure by quite a bit. Make it 0.17. I'm going to increase the texture to bring out more of the waves, and there we go. So before and after, look at that. Such a big change. Best part is none of the white areas have been affected, because if it had been, then the image will be way too bright. So let me show you. If I increase the exposure, look at how overexposed the water becomes. But since we were able to target specific parts of the water, the already exposed areas of the photo did not become overexposed. So the last thing I'm going to do is crop this image. I'm going to hit crop, I'm going to lock it, and I'm just gonna make sure that this is in the center. I don't want too much of this land over here, so I'm gonna just crop it in a little bit. Yeah, not too much. I think just right there looks pretty good. For Instagram, I might crop it 4x5 vertical, but we'll see. But that's all for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, subscribe. I try to make videos as often as I can. And I'll see you guys next time.